My name is Sorin Răzoare. I'm from LLA. Today I'll be presenting to you an insight over the main aspects to be addressed when you conclude an investment deal. If you have any questions during my presentation, feel free to address them. You don't need to wait until the final. I want to be more like an open discussion. As you all know, two of the most common types of startup investment, it's capital venture and angel investors. In both cases, investment is given in exchange of equity in your company. Usually, the usual arrangement is to split the investment into share capital and into a share premium in order not to extra dilute the founders. In all the cases, it's also possible a convertible debt alternative. The convertible debt is a loan which will convert into equity. Of course, this is most common in the seed stages by many angel investors. Of course, in order to give equity in a company, first you need an entity with shares. So incorporating a company is recommended to be done as soon as possible. In Romania, as you know, the most two common types of companies are a limited liability company and the joint stock company. I'll present a few differences between those two types of companies. The first one, limited liability, is probably the most used in Romania because of its very low initial share capital, which is around 50 euros. On the other hand, I see this company quite inflexible in terms of share circulation, in terms of decision process. I give an example. In order to transfer shares outside the company, you will need an approval of the General Assembly. Also, in terms of decision process, there are some decisions that cannot be passed to the board of directors. For example, if you want to give shares to your employees, stock options plan for employees, you have to do that through the General Assembly by the shareholders each time. You cannot pass this to the board of directors. On the other side are the joint stock companies. They have a significant higher initial share capital, around 20k euros. But on the other side, they are more flexible, more friendly with the investors. For example, circulation of shares can be done very easy just through a simple operation in the shareholders registry. You don't need to go each time to the trade register. It's very simple to operate. And also in terms of decision process, you can pass some important decisions to the board of directors. Of course, after you incorporate the company, you should make sure that all the IP rights are belonging to the company. So all the content developed by your employees, by your external collaborators, should be passing to the company. So make sure that in the contracts you have with your employees, with the freelancers, you have assignment clauses that effectively transfer the IP rights to the company. And also an important asset of a company is its brand identifier. The people will recognize your company or your product after a brand. So make sure you register the trademark. You don't want a situation where you have a popular product and you realize that another person registered that trademark. Of course, having a company, having all the IP rights assigned are not enough. An investor will want to make a due diligence towards your company. So the recommendation would be to try to prepare in advance the documents for any investor. Usually investors are asking documents about IP rights, about employees, about contracts, concluded shareholders, and so on. So if you organize them in advance, you won't slow down the process during a due diligence process. Also, it's possible to see if you have any items to clean from the past, of course, because a snag list came from the investor is not something good in the negotiation. Once the investor decides to invest in your company, in your startup, the most important thing, the first step to do is to conclude the term sheet. The term sheet contains the main aspects you agree upon with the investor and will be the basis of the future detailing in the long-form documents. Usually the investors are interested in two main aspects, economics and control. Some example of economics, price, liquidation preference, anti-dilution, and as regards the control, of course, protective provisions, board of directors, and so on. There could be also other terms in the term sheet, like condition preceding to financing, right of first refusal, disposal of shares, founders' activity, and so on. Before going into details to the main clauses of the term sheet, I would like to highlight some recommendation during the negotiation. First, it's recommendable not to send your term sheet to the investor. Better wait for him to send his term sheet. You never know what offer he will going to do, so why run the risk of aiming too low, of course. It's also recommended during the negotiation to try to address the deal points in the order of their importance, not necessarily in the order of the legal paper. So try to have a full picture over the main deal. Otherwise, you might lose the sight of the deal as a whole. And of course, try not to accept the arguments like that's the way it is because it's market. Try instead to discuss with your investor why some conditions needs to apply to you. And if the other party, of course, won't be able to justify, you might be on the higher ground. Now we're starting of detailing the main clauses in the term sheet. Probably after the price, or sometimes even equally important, is the liquidation preference. The investors like to be preferred in case of a liquidation event. By liquidation event, you don't understand only the bankruptcy of the company, also, for example, a sale of the company, sale of the assets, and so on. So it determines the payout order in case of a liquidation event. And it's especially relevant when the sale of the company is for an amount less than the capital invested, of course. And a special attention you should pay on is what type of liquidation preference the investor is proposing to you. It's a non-participating or a participating liquidation preference. And I'll explain the difference, the main difference between those two types of liquidation preference. Non-participating means that the investor will be returned with a minimum amount agreed upon, which is usually equal to the investment. But sometimes the investor will like also to have an extra margin guaranteed. So in this case of non-participating, as you can see, the investor gets either the liquidation preference, or he can choose to participate in the liquidation on a common equivalent basis, so he will take the share from the assets obtained to the liquidation event. Liquidation preference participating means that first he will get the liquidation preference with priority, and he will also participate to the liquidation with the other shareholders at the distribution of the remaining assets. And I'll show an example in this respect. So let's assume we have an investment, 500K, at a 1.5 million pre-money valuation. So of course you have 25% the investor, we have 75% the founders, and let's assume you have a 3 million liquidation event. So you have those two liquidation preference, non-participating and participating. You see that in the first case, the investor will get 25% of the liquidation event. In the second case, he will get with priority the liquidation preference of 500K, and then we'll take also 25% of the remaining amount. So in a total of 37.5 acquisition from the acquisition price, while the founders will get only 62.5 instead 75. So obvious, it's recommended to try to have a liquidation preference non-participating. And also you could try to get a time limitation for the liquidation preference. Normally the investor will ask for reasonable explanation if you ask such a time limitation. An example where such a limitation might be reasonable argued is where the investor is already holding the majority of the stake. So in that case, he will have a much more control of the company's business and implicitly over its future valuation. And last but not least, I would pay a special attention on the liquidation preference clause in order not to be a so-called leonine clause. The leonine clauses are the clauses under which one of the shareholders reserves for himself all the benefits or is exempted for participating to losses. In the Romanian law, such leonine clauses are considered unwritten. So be careful, because if such a clause is considered unwritten, it might generate all the deal termination in case this liquidation preference clause was an essential one for the investor when concluding the deal. Another important clause for the investor is the anti-dilution. It's a common and fair clause. Of course, the investor doesn't want to be diluted in future rounds. The common way of avoiding the future dilution is a right of first refusal. So in case of a future round of investment, this clause allows the investor to come with money in order to preserve his percentage in the company. So instead trying to eliminate them, try to focus on minimizing their impact. For example, in stating very clear the details of the right of first refusal. For example, the time frame in which the investor has to come with the money in case of a future investment round. Tag along. So as you can see, tag along protects the minority shareholders in case the majority wants to make an exit from the company, allowing the minority to join the deal on the same terms and conditions. And also drag along. Drag along protects the majority. In case they want to sell their stake, they can force the minority to join the deal under the same terms and conditions. So tag along is protecting the minority, drag along is protecting the majority. There are also investors who are proposing drag along clause in a way that even if they are in minority shareholders, they want to force the founders to make an exit from the company in case they find a proposed buyer. Of course, first thing you have to decide if you agree or not upon such a clause. Maybe you don't want to lose the control in the company, you don't want to sell the company for a price you don't like. But if you accept such a clause in principle, first thing recommended is to try to agree upon a formula for calculating the minimum price, which can trigger the drag-along clause proposed by the investor. Of course, try to avoid EBITDA, because it's It's, it's related to the profits, which is not relevant for a startup. Instead, try focusing on finding a matrix which is more suitable for your business in setting that formula. For example, a turnover of the company, a number of users of your product, and so on. An additional protection mechanisms in these kinds of drag along, which can be proposed by the investor, is to set a right of first refusal in your favor. It works like that. So let's assume the investor comes with an offer from a proposed buyer for a price which you don't like. So with the right of first refusal, you can say, okay, I'll buy your shares on the same price you got from the proposed buyer. But make sure you stipulate a sufficient term in the right of first refusal so that you have enough time to think about the price, if it's okay or not for you. And of course, for looking for possible financings to buy your investors' shares. Now we'll turn on the control clauses of the term sheet. Some of the most important control clauses are the protective provisions. Of course, any investor would like to gain as much control as possible in your company, which is natural, especially in what concerns deals which can affect their economic position in the company. And examples of hot topics can be increasing, decreasing the share capital, mergers, acquisition, selling of the assets, or most part of the assets, of all the assets, increasing or decreasing the numbers of board of directors, or they used to propose also any kind of deal which is amounting to more than a certain limit. Instead of focusing how to eliminate the protective provisions, try to minimize their impact by making a mechanism so you don't need the shareholders agreement, the investor agreement, in the normal course of business of your company. So you don't want in your business decisions, in the normal course of business, each time to have an agreement from the investor. A possible solution would be to try to set a larger majority for the hot topics, so that that majority cannot be achieved without the vote of at least one of the investors. Of course, it's recommendable to try to keep the number of investors' necessary votes as low as possible. Maybe you don't want to take an agreement from all the investors. It would be preferably to take just one's investors' vote. For example, if you have 70% in your company and you have 3 investors, let's say, with 10% each, it's preferable to have, for example, a majority of 80%, not 19%. So you need only one investor vote to pass a hot topic decision. As far as the examples of hot topics, most of them are common and fair. Regarding the one related to the deals amounting to more than a certain limit, try to set an amount as high as possible, and also to include some specific exclusions. For example, when you want to buy equipment in the normal course of business, or so on. Another very important clause for the investor will be the board of directors. Since the mechanism of appointing the board of directors is one of the key control mechanisms for the investor in your company. So most likely, any venture capital would like to have the right to include a member in the board of directors. Therefore, more investors, more members in your board named by the investors. But try to not lose the control in the board. For example, some of the investors propose something like this. Let us name 2 members in the board, You as a founder will name another 2 members, and the 5th member will be named mutually by us or by the other 4 administrators. Under the Romanian law, this is not possible because the administrators must be achieved by the shareholders in the General Assembly. So it's not possible to be named by one of the shareholders or to be named by the other members in the board. On the other hand, a possible solution to reach the same result would be to try to set these kind of arrangements through shareholders' agreements, while paying a special attention on the limitations on the Romanian law regarding the agreements on the vote. In the Romanian law, it's forbidden to agree upon how to vote at the indication of the company or of the company's representative. So try to avoid such kind of agreements, which are null and void under the Romanian law. And as regards the last member of the board, you could think of offering the investor the possibility to such a member to be named as an independent member by the shareholders' agreement. And independent means it cannot be a significant shareholder, which under the capital market law it's more than 10%, or it's their affiliates. Of course, you could also try to argue when the investor will propose the board of directors clause that he can control actually the hot topics also through the General Assembly, because you can set that larger majority in the General Assembly. So it's not necessarily to have this control by naming a couple of members in the board, since the board cannot decide upon the hot topics without the approval of the General Assembly. So this way the investor can be protected anyway, even if he doesn't name the desired number of members in your board. Of course, the disposal of shares restriction, it's a very important clause for many investors, because usually they will want you to stay in the company as long as possible. So often you will find this type of clauses in the term sheet, saying that you are not allowed to sell your participation for as long as the investor is a shareholder in the company. I think this is exaggerated. You cannot. It's recommended not to accept such a absolute restriction. Moreover, under the Romanian law, its validity is questionable. So, while having a sort of restriction in selling your shares, it's a fair and common in any kind of deal with startup investment. Try to stipulate a more specific term for such restrictions. For example, a couple of years, you have to negotiate with the investor for this. Or you can insert in this restriction specific exclusions. For example, if you have that drag-along clause, which forces the shareholders to sell the shares when the other shareholder is finding a proposed buyer, that could be an exception from the disposal of share restriction. For example, if you find a buyer for a very good price, that could be inserted in the term sheet like an exclusion from your restriction to sell the shares. And of course, such restriction to sell the shares is provided by the law itself for the limited liability companies. As I told you at the beginning of my presentation, the Romanian law provides that the disposal of shares outside a limited liability company cannot be done unless you have the approval of 3/4 of the capital. Therefore, in such a startup, if you got a finance in exchange of more than 25% equity, any sale of your shares outside the company will be blocked, can be blocked by the investor, since you no longer hold at least 75% of the shares. Now they've represented the clauses in the term sheet. Usually they are set in the term sheet as a principle, and then their form, the final form, will be negotiated and will be part of the long form documents. The long form documents are composed of the shareholders agreement, which will be detailing all the clauses which I presented. It usually contains all the clauses, anti-diluting, board of directors, protective provisions, and so on. And of course, we have the company's bylaws, which unlike the shareholders agreement, they are public. So they are published in the trade register, so anyone can see them. Among others, the bylaws are containing some rules of how the company is functioning, and often include also some of the clauses from the shareholders agreement, like tag along, drag along, and others. So if you have any questions, please feel free. Thank you.
So for a limited liability company, you mentioned that you need at least 75% stakeholding in order to be able to offer, to get additional investment. And if there are multiple stakeholders at that point, shareholders at that point, do you need at least 75%, or do you need the agreement from everyone in order to get additional financing?
So you have a limited liability company with
with multiple shareholders, and I don't own 75%.
You will need 75% of all the share capital.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter it's one or more.
Okay.
All together must sum up 75% of the capital.
Everyone who agrees to the deal needs to sum up 75%.
Everyone
who agrees to the deal to get more financing.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Who agrees that you as a minority, you sell your shares.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So not 100%.
Or not necessarily the minority. You can have, let's say, 60%.
Yeah.
And you need the agreement.
Additional 15%.
One of the people who will agree will be you. You need another 15%. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi. What are the risks of having a too crowded cap table, let's say from too many investors?
What is the risk of having too many people have
on the cap table?
On the cap table? I think that if there are more than one investor negotiating, I think it would be recommendable to try to have one of them representing all the others. It's more simple for negotiating. If it's not possible, it's an operational matter that you need to address with each of the investors. You need to negotiate with each of them. So it's better to try to have negotiating with just one of them representing all the other shareholders. Any other questions?
Hey, hi. Regarding a small amount of shares for the employees, what do you recommend best to implement? I mean, let's say I want to have a pool of shares or some other mechanism to be able to give parts of my business to the 10 first employees, let's say.
Yeah, of course. Actually, the employment pool can be a clause in the term sheet. There are investors which are proposing such clauses because it's also in their interest to encourage your employees. So, by making this employment pool, it's okay to set the mechanisms under which you will be able to issue the shares for your employees through the term sheet, to the long form documents, so to the investment agreement. And for example, If you have the joint stock company, it's possible to put in the shareholder agreement that the board of directors will have the right to issue those shares. And of course, you will have to decide to negotiate with your investor. Usually he will say, okay, I don't want to be diluted when we issue those shares, so I want to keep my percentage. So the one who will be diluted might be the founder, but this is something to negotiate with the investor. But it's recommendable to set all these rules in the investment documentation, in the shareholders agreement. And if it's done through a joint stock company, it's much more easier to proceed. All of this can be done by the board of directors. You don't need to ask each time the investor to agree to those employees' pool.
But as a legal form of sharing with their employees, are there any other options besides having a pool of shares? I mean, okay, let's assume that I don't want to have 10% set aside at the trade register through the documents. What other options are there?
Actually, if you give shares to your employees, you will need them registered. If the company is limited liability, you will need to register at the trade register. If it's a joint stock company, as I said, you just operate a simple shareholders registry. You don't go anywhere. You stay at your office and write in your shareholders register.
And is that legal? I mean, not
yes,
legal,
yes.
But is recognized by our laws?
It's
recognized by our laws?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. So it's very simple to do this. And usually you set a time frame for employees. You have to stay 1-2 years. It's like stock options plan.
Period, yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi. I don't know if you covered this one. Is there any update? Can you summarize about crowdfunding status in Romania? Is that already available? It's legally possible? Or if it's out of your scope? I'm asking about crowdfunding option.
Crowdfunding option, you mean more than one investor investing in?
Correct. The hundreds of smaller investors. It's not.
Yeah, it's possible.
It's available.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Good morning. For foreign company to be shareholder in a company in Romania, is it necessary to open a local company first, or can it invest directly?
It can invest directly. Doesn't have to have a local branch or something.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Hey, quick question regarding tips and tricks for fiscal optimizations for I don't know, liquidity events or the like. Because usually, should I repeat the question? Maybe fiscal optimizations for liquidity events. Usually, the way you set up the company and how you move forward predicts how much income tax and all the likes happen. So any tips and tricks for this?
Actually, the fiscal optimization is not something to address necessarily into a venture deal, because the company will have the same fiscal regime. Doesn't matter that it's a limited liability, it's a joint stock. It doesn't matter necessarily who is the shareholders, who are the investors. Maybe some tips might be for the founders, how they own the company. For example, if you own the company as natural person, or you have an investment vehicle. For example, you have a joint limited liability company, you are a sole shareholder. So there might be differences when you make an exit from the company. So it's not the same thing that you sell the shares when you make the big exit. As a natural person, you pay some taxes, some social contributions, and there are other taxes. If you sell like a micro enterprise, limited liability, you pay 1% if you have employees of the whole deal. If you sell like a natural person, you pay 10% from the profit. So there might be some difference, but in what regards how the founders will enter the startup. As natural persons, they have other vehicles. Otherwise, I don't see any relevant fiscal aspects regarding who is investing, what investors are, and which is the type of the company. I don't know if it is a good answer, but it's an answer.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation. Just a quick one. In the Romanian regime, are there any incentives for investors or any particular government-sponsored programs to encourage investment into technology and entrepreneurship, such as we have EIS and SEIS in the UK?
Not really. There are some fiscal advantages, but not for the investors necessarily, but for the company. For example, in IT, you have the salary tax exemption. Also, in researching, you have these kinds of exemption. For the investors, I don't think there is any such incentive for investing.
Thank you.
There might be special programs approved by the government, but those have to respect the competition law about state aid. But it's not something generally, in the law in this respect. Thanks. Welcome.